Hello once again. I have this very big question to ask you, and the question is simply this. How long do you think humans can survive without respiration? In terms of respiration, we can substitute the word respiration for oxygen. So we can also say how long can humans survive without oxygen? Now, medically speaking, I think that should be within 3 minutes or 4 minutes maximum. It is medically said that if someone holds their breath up to 4-5 minutes, the person might experience what we call brain damage. And if it extends up till 7, 8, or probably 10 minutes without oxygen, the person can also die. It can also be very, very lethal. So you see that oxygen, or the need for oxygen in us humans, is very vast. It's of so much importance. And the topic we're going to be looking at today is called respiration. I know we have talked so much about respiration. Please check in other of our videos and see how we've discussed so much about respiration, that which includes respiration system 1, part 1, the 2, and this is the third part of respiration. Now, the topic today, like I said, is respiration. And we're going to be looking at several objectives, things that at the end of this particular topic, you should be able to know, you should be able to explain or describe. Now, the first one, by the end of this topic, you, the learners, should be able to explain what we call the mechanism of respiration in animals. And I'm going to explain what I mean by mechanism of respiration. It simply means how does respiration occur? What are the working principles, or what are the processes that are involved during respiration? And as well, number 2 has to do with you explaining the respiratory system in plants. Do plants also undergo respiration? That has been a lot of questions that have been bothering the minds of so many students. Many students feel that respiration, plants don't respire, they don't undergo gaseous exchange. They only believe that plants undergo photosynthesis. We will be clearing such doubts, and I will also explain to you why plants undergo respiration, and also they do likewise undergo photosynthesis. Now, let's take a look at the first aspect of this topic today, respiratory system in mammals. Now, if you could take your mind back to what we have discussed earlier, you will understand that we discussed a lot about vertebrates. And I told you that mammals, they fall under the kingdom Animalia. And in kingdom Animalia, mammals can also be referred to as a chordata in terms of the phylum. Now, the phylum Chordata have different classes, mostly about 5 different classes. We have the class called the Pisces, which is actually the most primitive. We have the amphibians, we have the reptiles, we have the aves, which are the birds, and then we have mammals. Now, each of these vertebrates, they also have their respiratory organs. In terms of the Pisces, the respiratory organ is the gills, and in our previous classes on respiration, we have explained deeply the working principles or the mechanism of respiration in fishes, which is how the gills work. Also, we talked about, also another part of the class is, apart from Pisces, which is the fish, we have the amphibians. The amphibians, also the respiratory organs of the amphibians, we have about 4 of them. The amphibians includes the toad, it includes the frog, it includes the newt. Now, in terms of, let's take an example, the toad. Now, toad, the young toad is called a tadpole. Now, the tadpole have a different kind of respiratory organ. The respiratory organs found in tadpoles are called gills. And also in adult toad, they have 3 respiratory organs, which is the skin, the mouth, and the lungs. That of the skin is called cutaneous respiration. For the mouth respiration, it is also called buccal respiration. And if they respire through their lungs, it is called pulmonary respiration. Also, we have the reptiles. Reptiles also have their respiratory organ as the lungs. And the aves, which are the birds, they have their respiratory organs also called the lungs. Now, coming to mammals, their respiratory or the respiratory organ of mammals is the lungs. And in time to come, we're going to be looking at or exploring the working functions of the lungs. But please take note of this, that the respiratory organs in mammal is actually the lungs. In fact, that is where gaseous exchange actually takes place. Now, moving ahead, let's look at what consists the respiratory system of man or mammals. And we are using man as a case study, the respiratory system of man. Now, the respiratory system of man consists of the nostrils, that is the opening through which air comes at the nose. So it consists of the nostrils. It consists of what we call the pharynx, which is closely below the tongue. It consists of the pharynx. And then we have the larynx, which is the voice box. We have the trachea, which you can see it is a ring-like structure. It is made up of cartilage mostly. The trachea is also called the windpipe. The respiratory system of man also consists of the bronchus. After the bronchus, we then have the lungs. After the bronchus, we have the lungs. But inside of the bronchus, we have what we call the bronchioles as well as the alveoli. Bronchioles and alveoli. Now, look at the structure of what we're trying to talk about. That is a structure of the respiratory system in man. You can see the outer part of the man's face, which is the nose, but the passage through which air passes, or the tube or passage or tunnel through which air passes into the body is called the nostrils. As you can also see the pharynx. Immediately after the pharynx, we have the larynx. And you can see the trachea, it is made up of cartilage. Okay, that's the windpipe. Now look at the structure of the bronchus. Now the bronchus channels into the lungs. The bronchus channels into the lungs. Now inside of the lungs, we have smaller branches of the bronchus or bronchi. We have smaller channels of the bronchi. Those smaller channels of the bronchi are what we call the bronchioles. They are called the bronchioles. Now, the bronchioles ends in smaller sacs. You can see it. Those small sacs are called air sacs. And those air sacs are called the alveoli. Now, the alveoli is where air, or mostly oxygen, is trapped for some time or temporarily until gaseous exchange takes place between the alveoli and the blood capillaries. So this is what we call the respiratory system of man. Now, moving ahead, we have what we call mechanisms of respiration. Now, when we are talking about the mechanism of respiration, we're looking at how respiration occurs in man. What are the processes that are actually involved during respiration? What are all the processes? Now, the mechanism of respiration in man involves two main stages. It involves two main stages. Now, these two main stages, number one is called external respiration, and number two is called internal respiration. Now, I will be explaining much on external respiration as well as internal respiration. Now, let's take a look at the first one, which is called external respiration. Now, external respiration simply has to do with the breathing in of air and the breathing out of air. In other words, you can say that external respiration leads to gaseous exchange. It actually leads to gaseous exchange. Why do I say so? Because as air enters into the body, it gets to the point where those air are stored, and then from that point, we now have gaseous exchange. If you could recall vividly, I explained to you about the alveoli as the site or the part of the lungs where gaseous exchange actually takes place. So it is at the alveoli, but air has to get into the alveoli. And I've also explained to you some of the organs or the tissues or organs that actually makes up the respiratory system. And we're going to be looking at how respiration is being carried out, how breathing in and breathing out is actually carried out in man. Like I said, external respiration has to do with breathing in and breathing out of air. Now let's take a look at the processes that are involved during breathing in of air. What are the things that actually do occur? Now, first of all, please take note of this. Breathing in can also be called inhalation. You are inhaling air. That's what we call breathing in. Inhalation. It can also be called inspiration or inspiration. Okay? Inspiration, or you can call it inspiration, depending on your the phonics you're using. So it is called inhalation or inspiration. That is breathing in. You're taking in air. Now, there are several things that happens, several processes that occur or takes place when air is being taken into the body. Now, there are the lungs actually, if we look a little or digress a little to look at the structure of the lungs. The lungs actually is red in color, okay, and it is located at the thoracic region. Now, the thoracic region is actually the chest region. That is where you get the lungs. It's located at the thoracic region. Now, the thoracic region also consists of several parts, several tissues. We have things like the breastbone, which is called the sternum. We also have the rib cage, which is also part of the sternum, which is also part of the thoracic cavity. We also have the diaphragm, which is close to or beneath the lungs. We have the diaphragm very beneath the lungs. We also have the intercostal muscles, which are also found at the thoracic cavity. So all these parts of the thoracic cavity plays a major role during breathing in and breathing out of air. The lungs is a very powerful organ, very powerful. Like I said, the lungs also encases or envelopes the heart. So the heart is found between the two lungs. The lungs occur in pairs. So we have the left lungs and then we also have the right lungs. So, but the lungs occur in pairs and the heart is hidden or enveloped inside of or within or between the two lungs. Okay, so please take note that the lungs is located at the thoracic cavity. Now back to what we're actually talking about concerning breathing in. Now, during breathing in, there are several processes that are involved. And I told you it involves the thoracic cavity. Number one is that the thoracic cavity increases in volume. It increases in volume. Now, why does the whole thoracic cavity increase in volume? It increases in volume so that it can allow enough space for the lungs to expand when air enters into it. It allows enough space it creates space for the lungs to actually expand when air enters into it. Now, as the thoracic cavity increases in volume, the diaphragm, remember I explained about the diaphragm, found beneath the lungs, the diaphragm contracts and becomes flattened. The diaphragm contracts and then becomes flattened. Now, after the diaphragm becomes flattened, the next thing that happens is that the intercostal muscles contract. The intercostal muscles are muscles found at the thoracic cavity. They contract. And then the sternum, which is the chest bone, moves forward. The chest bone moves forward as you're breathing in. And then the next thing that happens is that the ribs move upward and outward. The ribs move upward and outward. So these are the processes that are actually involved during breathing in or during inhalation. The thoracic cavity increases in volume. Then also we have the diaphragm becomes increases and then becomes flattened. And then we also talked about the intercostal muscles, that it contracts. And then after it contracts, the sternum moves forward and then the ribs move upwards and outward. Now, once this happens, air containing oxygen from the outside environment, which is the respiratory medium, is then drawn into the body through the nostrils. Now, this is where the respiratory system comes into play. So it is drawn into the body first through the nostrils, and from the nostrils, it passes through the pharynx. From the pharynx, it then passes through the larynx, and from the larynx, remember the larynx is the voice box that helps us to speak. So it passes through the larynx, and from the larynx, it passes through the trachea, which is also called the windpipe, and from the trachea, this air passes through the bronchus, and from the bronchus, it enters into the lung, which causes the lungs, it enters into the lungs, and then from the inside the lungs, we have smaller networks or branches of bronchus, which is called the bronchioles. And from the bronchioles, it enters into the alveoli, which is an air sac. Now, based on air entering into the alveoli, which is an air sac, you will understand that the lungs begin to increase in size, or the lungs actually expands. Now, this expansion shows that air is already inside the lungs, and it is stored temporarily in the alveoli. Now, like I said before, if you could remember, I said that gaseous exchange takes place at the alveoli. So the air, right, which is now in the alveoli, every respiratory organ or respiratory surface is well vascularized. Remember last time when we were looking at respiratory system 1, we made mention of several conditions that are necessary for respiration to take place. One of them, we said there must be a transport medium. Now, the essence of this transport medium is to carry essential materials from where they are produced to where they are actually needed. Or you can say from where they are gotten to where they are actually needed, or where they are stored to where they are actually needed. Now, these essential materials are needed by cells as well as tissues. They are needed by cells and tissues. For instance, oxygen is needed, very much needed, for a lot of processes. Mostly it is needed to generate or produce or release energy to the body so that the body can carry out metabolic activities. If you could also remember and recall, I talked to you as we just started the class, and based on my introduction, I asked how long do you think a human can stay without respiration or without oxygen? So this oxygen is so vital and so much needed, so much needed. So once this oxygen or air rich in oxygen is stored temporarily in the alveoli, and the alveoli, or the lungs rather, is well vascularized, which means well supplied with blood capillaries, mostly red blood cells which contain hemoglobin. And of course, hemoglobin have a strong affinity for oxygen. So once this blood gets close to the alveoli, based on the hemoglobin, based on the affinity from hemoglobin, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the red blood cells and binds with this hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Now, this helps in transporting this oxygen from the alveoli through the blood to the body cells and tissues where they are needed to produce or release what? Energy. Is that okay? So these are the processes that occurs during breathing in of air or during inhalation. Now, the reverse of what we have just all spoken about is what occurs during breathing out. During breathing out. So what is actually breathing out? Now, breathing out can simply be called exhalation. Breathing out means exhalation, or you can call it expiration or expiration. Okay? Exhalation or expiration, that means giving out air. Now, during breathing out, there are also processes that takes place. There are also processes that takes place. Now, what are the processes that takes place? Now, during breathing out, the thoracic cavity, remember in terms of breathing in, we said the thoracic cavity increases in volume. But during breathing out, the thoracic cavity does not increase in volume this time. The thoracic cavity decreases in volume. The diaphragm no longer contracts, but this time it relaxes and assumes a dome shape, no longer flattened. So it is just the opposite of whatever happened during breathing in. So breathing out, the diaphragm relaxes and then assumes a dome shape. Then also the intercostal muscles relaxes. Instead of contracting this time, they relax. And then the sternum moves inward instead of outward. The sternum moves inward instead of what? Outward. And then also the ribs move upward and outward. The ribs move upward and then outward. So the ribs move downward rather and then inward. When it moves upward and outward is during breathing in. But when it talks about breathing out, the ribs moves downward and then inward. Now, once this happens, air containing carbon dioxide and water from the body cells diffuse into the bloodstreams. They diffuse into the blood. And the blood, which is a transport medium, carries this carbon dioxide or this air rich in carbon dioxide, carries them to the alveoli, and once it gets to the alveoli, gaseous exchange also takes place. The carbon 4 oxide or carbon dioxide diffuses into the lungs or into the alveoli, which is inside of the lungs. And from the alveoli, the air rich in carbon dioxide passes into the bronchus, and from the bronchus, it passes also into the bronchus, from the bronchus to the trachea, from the trachea to the larynx, and from the larynx to the pharynx, and then it comes out of the body through the nostrils. And once it happens this way, the size of the lungs also decreases. The lung will no longer expand or increase in size, but it will this time decrease in size. So these are the processes that occurs during breathing in and also breathing out. So remember again, breathing in means inhalation, and then breathing out means what? Exhalation. Now, take a look at what someone once asked the question, if I could remember. The person asked this question and said, is it the same amount of air, or the same composition, percentage of composition of air that enters into you that is coming out the same way? And that's no. Air that enters into you, in fact, air is a mixture of gases, which we all know, and it comprises of oxygen, it comprises of carbon dioxide, it comprises of nitrogen, it comprises of water vapor, it comprises of rare gases, and it also comprises of dust particles. But the major active compositions in air, mostly the active composition in air is oxygen. But we're not just looking at oxygen. The air that you inhale into yourself, it consists of 21% of oxygen, 0.03% of carbon dioxide, 78% of nitrogen, and the water vapor can be variable. But I want to concentrate much on oxygen, carbon dioxide, as well as nitrogen, which we have fixed figures or percentage for them. Now, oxygen that you inhale, 21, carbon dioxide that you inhale, 0.03, nitrogen that you inhale is 78 or even 79, as some books will tell you. But when you exhale this air, the percentage of oxygen no longer increases. It no longer increases. It will decrease because your body has made use of some of the oxygen. But please take note, your body doesn't take all the oxygen in air. No. It takes some few percentage of oxygen that is in air, about 16%. So you see, inhaled oxygen is 21, exhaled oxygen is about what? 16. All right, and then inhaled carbon dioxide is about 0.03, but exhaled carbon dioxide is about 4.1%. But in terms of nitrogen, the inhaled air nitrogen is 78 or 79, and then the exhaled nitrogen is also 78 or 79. Now, the reason is simple. Nitrogen has no need. It is not needed for anything in humans or in mammals. It can be useful in plants, but it is not useful in mammals as regards respiration. As regards respiration, it is actually not useful. Now, the reason why carbon dioxide is increased in exhaled air is because the body has finished making, in fact, if you look at the process of respiration, the byproducts of respiration is actually carbon dioxide and water vapor. So exhaled air is simply carrying byproducts of respiration. Inhaled air is actually carrying the products of respiration that is actually needed. And that is why oxygen inhaled is 21, but when you exhale it, it is what? 16, because your body has actually made great use of the oxygen that is actually inhaled. Now, moving ahead, we also have, remember we said we have two stages of respiration. One we have just finished explaining, which is external respiration. We have the next one, which is called internal respiration. Now, what is internal respiration? In fact, internal respiration has to do with the use of this oxygen. Remember, external respiration has to do with taking the oxygen into the body and removing carbon dioxide from the body. But internal respiration has to do with making the cells now making use of this oxygen to produce or release what? Energy. Using that oxygen that has been taken in to release or produce energy. Now, another name for internal respiration is called tissue or cellular respiration. The reason why it is called tissue or cellular respiration is because the tissues and the cells are actually what makes use of this oxygen. They make use of the oxygen to release what? Energy. Now, internal respiration actually occurs in the mitochondria as well as the cytoplasm. Now, during internal respiration, mostly two pathways are involved. And these two pathways are glycolysis as well as Krebs cycle. Glycolysis and Krebs cycle. Now, very quickly, what glycolysis is all about. As the name implies, glycolysis. Glyco is short form for glucose, okay? Lysis means to split. So it simply means it has to do with the splitting of what? Glucose. Now, during glycolysis, glucose is broken down into what we call pyruvic acid. It's broken down into pyruvic acid, and during this breaking down of glucose into pyruvic acid, oxygen is not actually needed in the first place. Oxygen is not needed or is not involved during glycolysis, that is during the breaking down of glucose into pyruvic acid. Oxygen is not needed. And also, little amount of energy is produced during glycolysis, about 2 ATP. 2 ATP. Now, ATP simply means adenosine triphosphate. The definition for ATP is that ATP is the form in which energy is produced, stored, and used up in the body during respiration. So every time you hear the word ATP, it talks about what? Energy that is being produced during respiration. So during glycolysis, about 2 ATP is actually produced. Also, during glycolysis, it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cells. It occurs in the cytoplasm of the cells. Now, after glycolysis, if oxygen is available, the next pathway respiration takes place, or the next pathway it follows after glycolysis is Krebs cycle. But if there is an absence of if there is an absence of oxygen, the next pathway will be anaerobic respiration. But after glycolysis, if oxygen is available, the next pathway is Krebs cycle. Now, during Krebs cycle, pyruvic acid that is produced during glycolysis is broken down by a series of chemical reactions which are controlled by enzymes to produce carbon dioxide and water vapor. And in the process of this, great amount of energy is produced, about 36 ATP. Now, if you compare that with glycolysis, during glycolysis we said it's 2 ATP, and then during Krebs cycle we said it is what? 36 ATP. So during aerobic respiration, if we put some of them up together, about 38 ATP is produced. So this is what happens during Krebs cycle. And please note also that Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. It occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. So this is what occurs during internal respiration. During internal respiration. Now, also practically, there are ways we can demonstrate using a model, a working model, to actually demonstrate respiratory system of mammals. Now, if you look at the screen there, you will discover that there is what we call a glass tube. There's a glass tube that is up, and we have balloons. Now, the glass tube, we can use that as the trachea, okay? And then we can just say that the balloons are what? The lungs. And then we have, you can see that there's a bell jar. Are you seeing the bell jar? The glass bell jar. Now that bell jar can be called the thoracic cavity. Now also we have a rubber sheet, that the black colored rubber sheets you see there. Now that black cover rubber sheet can serve as the diaphragm. We can use this as a model in several schools in order to demonstrate the working principles of respiratory system in mammals. Okay, now finally let's move into respiratory system in plants. Now, like I said before, that plants also respire. Let it not be a surprise. Plants also respire, and plants also carry out photosynthesis. Please note this. Plants do gaseous exchange. They take in oxygen just the same way animals take in oxygen, and they also breathe out carbon dioxide. Now, before we continue with that, I want you to understand that plants do not have a specific organ for respiration. They don't have specific organs for respiration. But the organ for respiration that is being used by plants are the stomata and the lenticel. Now, the stomata is actually located at the epidermis of leaves and also stems of seedlings of plants. That is where you can find the stomata. Now, each stomata is made up of, or each stoma is made up of what we call guard cells. Now, these guard cells, they are bean-shaped structures. Now, the opening and the closing of the stomata, stomata is controlled by the guard cells. The opening and closing of the stomata is controlled by the guard cells. So it means when the stomata is open, gaseous exchange or respiration takes place. When the stomata is closed, gaseous exchange does not take place. Now also, there are several processes that determines the opening as well as the closing of the stomata. Turgidity brings about the opening of the guard cells, and then flaccidity brings about the closing of the guard cells. Remember what turgidity is all about. Turgidity, or a cell is said to be turgid if the content of the cell is hypertonic compared to the environment where the cell is found. Now, if the environment where the cell is found is hypotonic as against the content of the cell, which is hypertonic, osmosis will set in. And osmosis is the movement of water molecules from a region of lower concentration into a region of higher concentration. So water will begin to enter into the cell, and the cell will begin to expand or swell and become fully stretched. The point where it becomes fully stretched is what we call turgidity. So once turgidity sets in, the guard cells are opened. And when the guard cells are open, gaseous exchange takes place. Also, in terms of the closing of the guard cells, like I said, it is flaccidity. And everything I have just described about turgidity, the opposite is what happens in flaccidity. That is when the cells, the content of the cells starts losing water, it then shrinks. Now, the shrinking, it shrinks to a point where the guard cells close. And that is what we call what? Flaccidity. And when the guard cells are closed, gaseous exchange do not take place. Now, that is for the stomata. Now, the lenticels are also tiny openings that are located at the bark or the stem of older plants. Okay, the bark of the older stems of what? Plants. Now, it consists of loose mass of small thin cell walls, which permits easy diffusion of gases in and out of what? A plant. Now, please take note of this. Now, this is how gaseous exchange takes place in plants. Now, especially during the night, plants undergo respiration. But however, during the day, plants do not undergo respiration, they undergo photosynthesis because of the energy from what? The sun. So at night, plants mainly undergo respiration, but during the day, plants mainly undergo what? Photosynthesis. Now, quickly before I leave, there is this big difference between respiration and photosynthesis. I'm just going to give three differences between respiration and photosynthesis. Now, number one is that respiration occurs in every living organism, both plants and animals. But photosynthesis occurs only in green plants. Only in green plants or autotrophs. And number two, respiration takes place at all times. It takes place at all times. Remember I said that photosynthesis in plants can take place in the night. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't take place in the daytime. It does, but not as much as it takes place at night. There's one major difference between the two of them, respiration as well as photosynthesis. Respiration occurs all the time, but photosynthesis occurs only during the day because of the presence of sunlight. And then finally, number three, respiration releases energy, but photosynthesis don't release energy. It rather makes use of energy to manufacture their own food. This is how far we go in this particular topic on respiratory system 3. But before we go, quick look at some few questions involving this topic on respiration. Very few questions. We're not going to take much of it. We have about 14 questions on this particular topic. Now look at this. In the process of respiration, energy is transferred from glucose molecules to molecules of what? Remember I told you in terms of respiration, energy is transferred, energy is produced, energy is stored and used in the form of ATP. So the correct answer there is ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. Now, look at question 2. Now, question 2 says, in plants, respiration occurs in where? A says, is it in the stomata and the lenticle only? B said, is it in the mesophyll cell only? C says, in all living cells. And D says, the roots only. The correct answer, it occurs in the stomata and the lenticle only. We've just mentioned that. And then question 3 says, yeast respire anaerobically to convert simple sugars to carbon 4 oxide, and the correct answer is alcohol. Now, this particular question can be answered if you have seen some videos we have done on respiration. And then finally, question 4, they said anaerobic. Okay, let's pick something relating to what we have done. Okay, now look at this. The enzyme of glycolytic pathway are located where? It is in the mitochondria. In the mitochondria. Okay, so that is the glycolytic pathway. Mostly it occurs in the mitochondria. Thank you for participating in today's class. You can practice more questions using your ExamGuide app. The app scores and gives a detailed explanation of all the questions at the end of your practice test. You can also learn particular topics of interest with different modes like study mode, mock mode, and even practice mode. It also has other features that makes learning very fun. Now, it is a must for all serious students. Download from www.examguide.com if you don't have it yet. See you in the next class. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, hit the notification bell, and share the videos to your loved ones and friends that will benefit from it. Bye for now.